I think the great example is with the Caitlin Clark phenomenon. There were a lot of people saying, wait, hold up, Lynette Woodard at Kansas also scored this many points. And just because it wasn't the NCAA, can we acknowledge her? And then all of a sudden, everybody knew who Lynette was, and people didn't know that before. So it takes the media members like us and the broadcasters to really say their names, say these women's names and their accomplishments to get people to say, I didn't know. I don't think anybody expects everybody to know the history. Even us, we don't know everything that was in women's basketball history, but for somebody to acknowledge it and say it out loud, that's where that avalanche of information will start to fall and will get people more excited about the history.
From top journalists and authors to rising influencers and insiders, Hoopsology brings you the voices driving basketball forward. With elite guests and sharp analysis, Matt, Justin, and Alan keep you plugged into everything hoops. From downtown, boom shakalaka!
They are the authors of Court Queens, celebrate the players, teams, and history of women's basketball. We have the pleasure in welcoming Emma Baccellieri and Jordan Robinson onto Hoopsology. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Nice to be back.
Yeah, for sure. And we've talked to Jordan in the past a couple of times, but we haven't asked her this question. And this is a question we ask all of our guests. So for Jordan and Emma, take this question any way you want it. What is your first or favorite basketball memory? Whoever wants to go first.
My favorite basketball memory, I have so many. I have so many memories. One that came to mind recently because it was my college's homecoming this past weekend, and they did a little write-up on my time playing college basketball at Point Loma. And they talked about how we went to Alaska during the Division II tournament, and we were the last seed and upset the number one seed on their home court. And it was in Alaska, Anchorage. The whole city was there in the arena. And we were just jumping up and down. It was such an upset. And then we got blown out the next game because it's so hard to play right after that. But that moment that we upset in Alaska, that's probably one of my favorite basketball memories. That was so fun.
Wow, mine does not compare to playing in Alaska. I was going to say the driveway with my dad, which is both the first memory and I think also a favorite memory of just, I was never a great player. I washed out by middle school, but just remembering how it felt to be in the driveway on our neighborhood court with my dad, those really early games of horse, just like practicing free throws together. Those memories were so foundational to loving the game, even though I didn't go on to play very much. And just, what you get from that time, with your family, with your parents, that kind of the father-daughter connection, it just was so special as like a different place to grow that relationship was really cool. And yeah, much closer to home than Alaska. Definitely no fun college upsets there, but yeah, something that I've always held very dear, and that it's cool to see everyone who has their own version of that relationship when they first had the game. So, yeah.
So how did those foundational memories with the game of basketball influence just your development of Court Queens? Can you just talk about that in terms of how the idea was introduced and, using your previous experience with the game to, create this book, which is fantastic, by the way. I just love the images and just going through the game and just the little tidbits. I think it's excellent. I always say this, but with a lot of our authors, but I do feel like this is a must for Hoops fans. So how did your foundational memories shape the development of the book?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. That's so kind of you. And I think mostly it's just about a love of the game that I think we say in the introduction. This is a love letter to women's hoops, and that we wanted that feeling to come through on every page, that this is about the history of the game. There are, players in here that we never got to watch play from long before we were born, or anyone alive was born, frankly. There are players who were in all different types of contexts, whether it's college, professional, AAU, Olympic, high school, different variations of the game, 6-on-6 before it was 5-on-5. But all of it is about loving the sport. And I think that kind of passion for the game and all the different ways that can manifest was something we wanted to come through. And all of the photographs and all of the essays, even when it's telling kind of more of a story of struggle or of, fighting to be on the court, that it's all about the love of the game. And I think that really kind of was in there. And I don't know, Jordan, what would you want to say?
No, I think that hits on it perfectly. That's what I was going to say. Yes, I have that memory of Alaska Anchorage, but it started in the driveway. It started in front of our house with my dad, with my brother. And we say it's our love letter to the past, present, and future of women's basketball history. And that's really the fun part of being able to put something like this together is yes, we were in, the early 2000s, the 90s, the 2010s, but there's so much that happened before that, and there's going to be so much that happens after. So yeah, it was so fun to tell those stories, and it starts from when we were little and young girls watching women's basketball on TV.
Was there anything surprising that you discovered in your research that really astonished you when the stuff that made into the book that you didn't know prior? Because you probably did a bunch of research, you have a bunch of knowledge about the game, but there's anything that surprised you that you didn't know that made it into the book?
A lot. Just a ton of research, especially those early decades. I think one that stood out for me was I had just mentioned 6-on-6, and I had kind of always thought of, women played 6-on-6 when they weren't allowed to play 5-on-5, and that was kind of a consolation prize in some ways. And, it was really interesting to learn that for a lot of those women, they loved 6-on-6 on its own terms, and that they actually really loved in certain parts of the country, particularly the Midwest, and especially Iowa had a very strong tradition of it. The fact that it meant that the game wasn't directly compared to the men's game, that it was considered this is completely its own thing. No one has to look at it as, lesser or something different. It's its own game. And that meant that they really loved it. And lots of women felt really strongly about continuing to play 6-on-6 in a way that I just had never considered before I started researching it and reading the stories of these women and hearing what they had to say. And so many of them really felt strongly about, like, this isn't lesser, it's just different, and it's our game. And I think there are lots of ways that kind of manifests in that early history where, because the game looked so different from what we see now, it's easy to think like, oh, they were doing this because they weren't allowed or they couldn't play the way that they would want to play, but they actually really loved what they were doing. And just seeing all of the different ways that the game could be something totally separate from what we see now, but still was something that these girls and women really loved was really interesting.
Yeah, everything was surprising. I think that was such a fun part about researching. One thing that was super surprising, and because this is both Emma and I's first book that we've ever written and really put together, and I think the photos part was so much fun to dive into and look at the archival and get, people's personal collections and personal photos. But, during, I want to say about the 70s, there weren't a bunch of photographers on the baseline covering these games. It was really just Sports Illustrated, just one outlet kind of capturing it. And it was surprising that, not everybody was hype about a national championship game, even though it was at the highest level, and it was still like one photographer, maybe two photographers, and we didn't have a ton of photos to choose from. Whereas today, when we're looking up Las Vegas Aces pictures, there's thousands and there's so many options. So that was surprise. I guess I'm not surprised that it wasn't that big of a deal, but I'm also, when we're trying to put together a book and we're trying to get so many options of photos, they just didn't exist.
Do you think with the recent rise in popularity of women's basketball, there's going to be more of a push like yourselves and maybe others? Maybe I'm more talking about from a broadcast perspective, as we see more broadcast partners airing, women's basketball games on a regular basis. Do you think you'll see them focus on the history of the game a lot more? Because from what I see, it's a lot more of like what's happening now and what maybe happened in the 2010s and in more in terms of the development of the WNBA and the Olympic team back in 1996, and not anything really prior to that other than really Cheryl Miller. And I just hope that there's a lot more just pieces and retrospectives on the history of women's basketball kind of besides those, which is great. But I think this getting the complete picture will help kind of put things that we're seeing, in 2026 in context. Do you think that, others within this space will start to focus on that?
I hope so. And I think we are seeing it in some ways. One small piece here that's really excited me is I feel like we've seen a shift in when broadcasters or media members are giving comps for current players using W players or past W players rather than NBA players. It's fine to have both, but showing that you don't have to have that bridge to fandom automatically default to who's an NBA player, that listeners are going to recognize the fact that there are past W players, current veteran W players who listeners either already know about or will want to hear more about when they hear that name. That's a really cool piece that I think we've seen more of that I appreciate. And I do think that it's so important here that when you talk about how you grow the sport and how you build fandom, that context is important, that generational connection is important, of being able to kind of have this fandom and knowledge of the sport be something that can be passed down, that you can connect across years and decades. And I think it's so important to how you talk about the sport, how you grow the sport, to show that there's so much here, that this didn't just suddenly rise up in 2023. And there's a ton to pull from. So I think it's exciting, certainly in the W, but I think you're starting to see more of it in college too, that, you know, something I really appreciated last year covering the Sweet 16, Elite 8, Final Four, before I closed at UCLA, was so adamant to say, you know, this is UCLA's first NCAA Final Four, but women were playing college basketball before the NCAA, and UCLA had a Final Four then. And you saw several stories that pulled on that thread that I thought were really cool. And I think you do see a lot of people in the sport who want to make those connections, who are aware of that history, and who want to tie it back. So yeah, I think it's so important. And I think you are seeing more, and I hope you see even more going forward.
Yeah, we got to get everybody a copy of Court Queens, and then they'll be able to know what to reference in the history. I love everything Emma said. And just to add on to it, you know, I hope that we are able to step into more of a historic concept, because then that makes everyone realize that women's basketball didn't just pop up, you know, over a couple years from now. I think the great example is, you know, with the Caitlin Clark phenomenon, there were a lot of people saying, wait, hold up, Lynette Woodard at Kansas also scored this many points, and just because it wasn't the NCAA, can we acknowledge her? And then all of a sudden, everybody knew who Lynette was, and people didn't know that before. So it takes the media members like us and the broadcasters to really say their names, say these women's names and their accomplishments, to get people to say, oh, I didn't know. I don't think anybody expects everybody to know the history. Even us, we don't know everything that was in women's basketball history, but for somebody to acknowledge it and say it out loud, that's where that avalanche of information will start to fall, and will get people more excited about the history.
Can you discuss the women's game from a college perspective? Because for myself, I think I might have told you this, Jordan, or not, but myself and my co-hosts were from Albuquerque, New Mexico, a huge, really home of women's basketball, huge popularity with the Lobos, of course with the men's side, but also with women's basketball as well. So it wasn't like an anomaly to see women's basketball become popular. It was popular in Albuquerque, just with the women's team. Did you discover that kind of in other states around the country in terms of how the popularity from a college perspective was, different than, your typical Tennessee or from Connecticut, just other colleges, around the country that, there's hotbeds around for, women's basketball from the college game. So in terms of the popularity from a national perspective, it's not super surprising that this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many communities that, personally, I'm from North Carolina. I'm from the Triangle, where, college basketball is everything. And you have that dynamic replicated in so many places, I think, kind of like you were saying, including in communities by schools where maybe they're not powerhouses, maybe they're not even D1 schools, but because there have been strong community connections that have built over a long time, there is that really, really strong fandom that kind of had just been waiting for a moment to see it blow up across the country like this. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me in doing the research here was that, I had known that there was organized college basketball for women before the NCAA, but I didn't realize just how far back that, like, our first college game that we have in the book here, not a sanctioned game, not with an organized governing body, but the first time two schools played each other was Stanford and Cal played in 1901.
Wow.
Yeah, and just kind of a one-off. But there have been women playing in college for a really, really long time, even if it wasn't under an organized infrastructure, even if it went through ebbs and flows over decades where it kind of disappeared a little and then it came back. That there are communities where this has been going on a really, really long time, and that there have been fans for decades and decades and decades who have built those programs and those communities and that kind of support into what it is.
I want to get your guys' perspective, and this might be kind of the wrong question to ask, but I'm very curious in terms of just where the women's game is going to go within the next, 10 to 20 years, because I feel like with the NBA, with a lot of the decision makers, it's more about developing the game from an external perspective in terms of expansion and technology and social media. And I feel like with the women's game, that's not the case. Do you feel like in order for the women's game to grow, do you think there should be a combination between, evolving the women's game in terms of this the rule set, evaluating what is happening in terms of the evolution of athletes, or do you think there should be more of a push on what the NBA is doing in terms of, pushing the game more internationally, getting involved in technology, entertainment, Adam Silver really is into that. And I don't know. I feel like with the NBA, I feel like the product has somewhat diminished. And I don't want that to happen with the W because I feel like the product on the floor is great. And I don't want kind of the NBA's problems just to spread to the W. So do you think, is that a concern for both of you, or do you think that the WNBA is on a completely different path than the NBA?
Yeah, I think it's a little different. I also think of how the WNBA, this is only the 30th season, and the NBA we're inching closer to 80.
Yeah.
So maybe by year 80, you try some new things and we try something different, but we're still, so young in a professional league, and still the WNBA is the longest running pro league right now for women's sports. So I think, and just this is just aligned with more of my job, just the storytelling aspects. I love what Unrivaled is doing right now because it allows fans to be connected to the players outside of the WNBA season. You latch on to players and then you will go watch them in the WNBA, regardless of what team they're on, regardless of who they're playing, you're going to tune in to watch your favorite player. And I think that was something that the W has really struggled in past years of being able to show the personalities of these players, tell their stories, their backgrounds. While we were writing the book, something that I really paid attention to just as a fan was, why did it take so long to bridge that gap from college fandom to the WNBA? You had UConn games and Tennessee games that were selling out. People are diehard fans in college. But then they would go to the W and those fans trickle down by a lot of numbers. So now we're starting to get that. We're Paige Beckers is at UConn. All of those UConn fans are coming to watch her in Dallas. Like there is a equal gap there. And so I think that's because Paige has millions of followers on Instagram. You've seen her on ads. You know that she likes to color her hair pink. You know that she's on TikTok. You can understand her personality and latch onto her as a fan of her rather than having to be a fan of the whole league. And that's a difference. And I think the NBA has so many opportunities for their players for fans to get to know their players. And I just want the W to focus on that, the marketing part, and then we'll focus on everything else. But we just need more fans in the seats. And that's one way to do it.
Yeah, 100%. And in terms of the product on the floor, one of the things that I think is really exciting to think about is that, we're only a few years removed from a situation where you had combo coach GMs, you had just one or two people who were overseeing everything that had to do with both the front office side and the coaching side. As we've finally seen them move away from that model, but as we continue to see investment where you have full dedicated front offices who are looking at more advanced stats, who are more interested in more advanced data, you have wearables, you have better quality tech to kind of figure out what players are actually doing. You're getting closer to bridging that kind of info gap and tech gap with the NBA. You have, bigger coaching staffs. You're attracting, in some cases, higher quality candidates who now see the women's game as a more viable place. I think that's so exciting to think about where that's going to go in a couple of years when you think about how much you can do with a dedicated front office who have the materials and the resources to actually really do more effective player development and scouting and all of that. And you have coaching staffs who can really put that into practice. And that's what I think is so exciting when you're looking at, where is this going to go in terms of talent development and stuff. You obviously have great players to begin with, but how much more that can be the case when you have both that piece of the puzzle and also players not having to practice at community rec centers and everything that comes into, actually treating players with so much of what it traditionally is meant to be a professional athlete. That's really cool to think about as we see the game on the floor continue to evolve beyond just the, strategic changes and stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree, especially with the expansion teams and even the current teams within the W upgrading their facilities to mirror their other counterparts and other organizations. I think that really helps in terms of putting out the best performances for these athletes. And I also add from a broadcast perspective, I think that from the storytelling you're mentioning, Jordan, I think that was imperative what ESPN has done recently, just in terms of like the big three, right? With like Elle Duncan, Shanae, and Andrea Carter. It's a bummer that Elle left, but I just think seeing them, that's the first time you saw a dedicated broadcast team, in my opinion, just be, I don't know, excited about, have their own chemistry associated with women's basketball. Like, and then, we see, a lot of, male leagues, you have these, like, all these teams from a broadcast perspective that people love, from inside the NBA or NFL on Fox or, whatever league people want to watch. And I think, for the first time, the W had that. And even from, Ryan Ruocco and Rebecca Lobo, I mean, they're associated with big time women's basketball from the WNBA or college. Like, if there's a big game, I want those two comment, doing a commentary on it. I don't want any other broadcast team. So I think there's been huge strides from a broadcast perspective, also from podcasts too, like yourself, Jordan, and then with Christina Williams, and then just with others, journalists that we've talked to. We started the podcast in 2020 to see the evolution in terms of how much they have grown, and now they're working at big time networks. That's been imperative too in terms of growing the W as well. So that's been awesome to see, and I think that's played a factor in terms of how the game has grown as well. Along with the product. So that's been awesome. I want to shift to just this moment in time in terms of what we're seeing in women's basketball. And where do you think, when we look at, the game 20, 30 years from now, how do you think this period's going to be reflected upon, in the future? It's because I think this is a critical point in terms of just technology, newer leagues, the players, gaining a lot more popularity. How do you think this era is going to be reflected upon in the future?
Yeah, I think there's a huge CBA agreement that's really going to set the tone. That's the first thing that comes to my mind, because we are at a pivotal point, and the players are recognizing their value, and they are wanting to make a deal with the WNBA that doesn't only set them up, but sets the future, sets the Juju Watkins, the Hannah Hidalgo, the next generation of great basketball players that are coming into the WNBA. This is going to help them, and this is going to set the tone for the things that they can get on a monetary level, but also on a respect level and everything that they've done for the league. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. But where we are in the WNBA, I think in women's basketball specifically, is figuring out a way how we can capitalize on all these eyes, with this is what we have been shouting from the rooftops, that women's basketball is amazing and there are hoopers out there. Now that eyes are on us, what are we going to do about it? We need to be able to capitalize, and we're already seeing that with cities wanting to join in. People are wanting to throw money because they want to be a part of it. They also understand that this is a business, and a lot of women's sports fans spend money. They want to be at games. They want to buy merch. They will buy league pass. They want to be involved. And so we're seeing a lot of businesses kind of jump on that. And this feels like the beginning, but even though we wrote a whole book about how there's been a lot of beginnings, but this feels like a new one. And I can't wait for, hopefully one day we make a volume 2 of this book, and we can start from 2026 and how Unrivaled is making $2 million in one day in Philadelphia. And we have Project B coming. That's a whole new international league that's going to be paying players allegedly millions of dollars to play around the world. Athletes Unlimited. So there are so many other options right now for women's basketball players, even just in America, besides going overseas. And yeah, we could start a whole new chapter just from what's happening this year alone. So that makes me really excited just as a fan.
Yeah, 100%. And beyond that, I hope that this could kind of be an inflection point in the way that people talk about the game and the stories that get told about the game. That, something that I feel like has finally started to shift in the last couple of years is that for so long, and like for me in the early years in my career, and certainly for people who had been trying to tell these stories for years before that, it felt like so often the only stories that could kind of get told or that people wanted to hear were about the state of the league as an economic or social project. And where is women's basketball going? Is women's basketball in trouble? How do you fix it? All of these big macro storylines about the state of the game and what it means for women in sports and what it means for women, period. And all of these big kind of macro storylines that are certainly important, but also like, I want to talk about the game. Like, I want to be able to cover this as a sport and treat these athletes just as athletes and not have to have this larger cultural positioning for every single little thing. And it's really cool to finally have gotten to a point where there's been enough of a shift where that doesn't have to be the framing for every single thing. It's just so gratifying to see that people are finally ready. There's a big enough audience that, like, the decision makers and the powers that be have finally realized people want to hear about these athletes and as people, and not just as symbols of here's what they mean for women in sports. And that's really cool, who they are as individuals and who they are as players and what they're actually doing on and off the court. And that shift has been really gratifying to see. And I really, really hope that we're at a point where that shift is finally kind of becoming more baked in and just broadening the horizon for what coverage can look like, what players feel they can do with their careers and their lives across the board. It seems like we're at a shift here, and I hope that's the case.
Yeah, and I think it's spread up to all of women's sports. I live in Denver, and they're putting an NWSL team here. They're building a new stadium. Broncos, their home field's going to have 50,000 people, could be more than that, for the opening. So I think it's all through women's sports. It's pretty incredible to see. Final question for both of you. For fans that pick up the book, what is the lasting impression do you want them to have after just reading everything? What are kind of the main things that should be imprinted on their minds when they check out the book?
Well, for me, it's these photos. I think the photos were so important that they're not all photos that you can just find on Google. They were curated and they feel personal and fun. And so I hope that even if you're just flipping through it, you have a lasting impression just by seeing these photos for the very first time. And then the other thing that, we keep saying over and over is that women's basketball has been here. It's been here for a really long time. And that is what I hope everyone from the first chapter, which is all about the pioneers, and that women were in long dresses down to their ankles, high heels sometimes, having a basketball in their hands. It looked different, but it was still that same passion and love for the game that's been here for decades, for a very long time. So I hope people just can pay their respects to the women who laid the foundation to where we are today.
Yeah, I don't think I could say it any better than that.
Well, I appreciate you both making the time. Congratulations on the book. Can you let our audience know where you're located on social media, any upcoming projects where they can find the book, and anything else you want our audience to be aware of as well?
Yeah, I'm under my name on all platforms: Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, in Sports Illustrated, where I'm a staff writer. And we do have some events for the book coming up in New York City for me, and in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And then Jordan is going to have some as well. So if you can come see us IRL, that would also be really cool.
Yeah, we'd love to see you IRL. My big event is in Sacramento coming up on March 20th, my hometown. And then I'll also be in LA March 28th at Untamed Spirits, the women's sports bar out here. But you can find me on all of the social platforms, probably too many, and listen to the Women's Hoop Show wherever you get your podcast.
Congratulations on the book to the both of you. Thank you very much for making the time. Thank you.
Thank you.